There's a change in format this evening. The other lecturer, Gary Page, was taken very ill the last couple of days, and so he's unable to speak tonight. So Mr. Abraham is going to play both parts. He's going to give I think the upside of that is that he's going to be able to give I think an extended talk, be able to speak longer about his work. First, I would like to introduce Thom Mayne, who is going to be introducing Mr. Abraham. I'm not going to say anything about Thom. You know Thom, dear friend of mine, of course. So here's Thom to introduce Mr. Abraham.
It's a pleasure to introduce somebody that one respects and has influenced one's life. It is presently impossible to assess a common system of values in a pluralistic world where reality is chaotic, unpredictable, and hence ultimately unknowable. Hazard becomes the principle by which the universe operates, more and more influenced by mass media and the collective impact of decisions which have been decentralized through our economic and political institutions and the processes they pursue. The tendency today is to perpetuate values designed to optimize the normative and the consumptive aspects of a society which serves the needs of a middle class in its search for self-determination. One of the central themes of architecture today is the question of whether one can act independently from the psychological and social forces inherent within this environment. Understanding that giving in to this power robs the individual of his or her authority, meaning, understanding, and history. One of the refuges available is the world of intimate life. Intimate life understood as one's secret, something valuable, a basis for originality, and able to be utilized as a generative force for observing and investigating human existence. Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist, talks of the self and the self through his work as the sum of everything we remember. Forgetting is a form of death always present in life. Abraham discusses his own work in regards to memory and tactility. The first for its capacity to ascend the individual, the survivor. The second for its direct impact on the subject, one that escapes the primacy normally accorded to sight. The work we will see tonight has the capacity to transcend the day-to-day circumstance, forcing us to acknowledge the deeper potentialities of meaning, potential within his contemporary architecture. A body of work interested in the physical and the temporal continuity of the Earth's surfaces, its weight, its substance, explores a territory between idea and matter, a synthesis of abstraction and sensuality, of the tectonic and the tactile, the cosmic and the erotic, transmitted to us by his constructions and through the construction of his drawings, which are autonomous entities finding themselves somewhere between idea and physical reality. I've personally known his work since the early 70s and have been greatly moved by the power and the single-mindedness of his visions, as I'm sure have many of you here tonight. The world today needs mysteries more than solutions, because curiosity about the unknown prompt an active participation in the quest for understanding and knowledge. Raimund Abraham.
I would like to thank Thom for this introduction, because it's usually introductions are like cheap obituaries. And this one was labored and was guided by compassion for ideas, and that's why I'm here for. Actually, I was all prepared for this new concept of tandem lectures, because I thought it was sort of like a combination of Family Feud and Hollywood Squares. And so I had to readjust during the afternoon to return maybe to the solitude of my own, or the singularity of my own work. First, I would like to respond to those. I got this little announcement, this little brochure, which introduced the idea of discussing, I think it was, what was the first one? Dreams, right. Dreams, fantasies, and beliefs. So I thought about that, and I came to the conclusion that I dream only in my sleep. My beliefs are secret, and my fantasies are the normal boundaries of my subjective reality. So these are, I would say, conditions of my own solitude, and I am unable to talk about that. That's private, and I think one has to protect one's privacy, but I'm here to talk maybe very simply about how I make work, because the only thing I know. And this making of the work fluctuates. It fluctuates between different endeavors which partially have to do with my teaching, which has to do with theory, has to do with my compassion for philosophy, literature, and other disciplines outside of architecture. But when I work, I only think about architecture. It means when I draw, I'm more involved about the problem, how to draw that line I wanted to draw, than about any kind of theoretical speculation about the meaning of drawing, the making. I prefer to speak without this thing here. So there is a certain simplicity, I think, about labor. Maybe my father taught me the virtue of labor. He was a winemaker, and he encouraged me very early to get jobs and work with my hands. And I think this has become one of the, I think, greatest virtues which I cherish now. And this maybe also gave me the strength to continue the work as an independent. You see, in this little brochure, there was a date given for beginning of my practice. It said 1982, I started my practice, which was really funny, because 1982, I mean, I know what it meant that I started to build again in 1982. For me, to practice architecture has nothing to do with building. It has to do to practice the discipline of architecture. That sense, architecture is for me a discipline, as cinema, as literature, as philosophy, painting, sculpture, whatever the disciplines are which have been founded by the muses of the arts. So, what I want to say is I am not a practitioner, I'm not a professional, I never will be one. I never had an office, I never will have an office. And ultimately, when I'm standing here now in front of you, out in the public, I always ask the question why I'm doing it. Why am I here? I would prefer the solitude of my studio to continue my work. So there are, of course, many reasons. Some are trivial. I mean, I love to come to LA, visit my friends. I love this place here. Little bit of exhibitionism, showing your work in front of the public. But maybe for me, the most convincing argument is that after 20 years of teaching, you become a little bit of a preacher. You hope that you can save some souls. And when I mean saving souls, is to find students who are willing to accept the necessary resistance to the temptations of our time, As a matter of fact, temptation of all other times before and probably times will come. The temptations of being absorbed by circumstance, whatever the circumstances might be. The temptations of career, the temptations of success, the temptations of money, of power, all those circumstances which are detrimental to the pursuit of the arts. Because an artist has to be in opposition to all the supporting forces of society. He has to be ultimately antisocial. And so there is for me, philosophically, and this is also reflected in my work, particularly in the later work which I'm going to show, which is built work of the last 10 years, when one gets sort of departs from that, in a way, comfortable world of one's own imagination into the world where one has to fight against those circumstances to find out to what extent one could translate or transcend that professional reality through the ideas one had labored in the autonomy of one's own imagination. And so what I really would like to do tonight is just show some very few seminal projects of my independent work, or work of whatever you want to call it, and the build projects from 1982 to the present time. Could I have the first slide? Can we turn the light off? I mean, this image has almost become sort of like a private icon of mine, but I'm not ashamed to show it again and again and again, because it expresses maybe in its most simplest form my belief of originality, that we are now at a time where there seems to be a craze for originality, which, as you well know, created a number of tempting fashions, which particularly the students are exposed to. And those fashions are nothing more than attempts to circumvent the real problem of architecture. Because if the circumvention of the ultimate problem of the fatality of our life, that we are born and we know that we are going to die, and if architecture or any architectural program which does not touch upon those fundamental conditions has nothing to do with architecture. So what we are witnessing is a futile attempt to create an artificial kind of actuality which is ultimately unreachable. And I just read a very short passage by George Kubler from The Shape of Time about actuality. Actuality is when the lighthouse is dark between flashes. It is the instant between the ticks of the watch. It is the void interval slipping forever through time, the rupture between past and future, the gap at the poles of the revolving magnetic field, infinitesimally small but ultimately real. It is the interchronic pause when nothing is happening. It is the void between events. So it describes, of course, that phenomenon of actuality which any creative artist is intrigued by, tries to reach it, never able to reach, which can never be manipulated, can never be artificially produced, and I believe can only be reached by proximity. Why did they come forward? Okay, I will try to speak louder. That the return in that attempt to be original or redefine originality. For me, originality is nothing more than the possibility to cut through, not to accumulate knowledge about history, but cut like an iconoclast through history back to those origins where the discipline of architecture has emerged. So when I return to that image of the site the ontological side, as I call it, where the horizon is produced by the collision of the sky and the earth, and that the horizon neither belongs to the sky nor to the earth, but becomes the most vulnerable condition of sight. When whatever you think, draw, build in the context of architecture has to violate that horizon, that ontological condition of a site. So I believe that if one wants to be original, one has to regain a sensibility which one, of course, has lost to all our education, our exposure to the vulgarity of our times, and return to a point where one becomes aware again that the slightest scratch into that surface of the earth, in that surface that makes the horizon of the site, would already be a significant intervention, would signify the beginning of architecture. So for me, architecture is detrimental to design. Architecture is an occurrence. It has to occur first. There has to be an event that takes place. One has to dig a hole, one has to scratch the earth, one has to build a mound, and then one has to decide what formal condition this elemental occurrence will take shape. In the process of exploring through my work those conditions of that elemental occurrence, there is a series of what I call the 9 houses, a series of houses which are imaginary by their site. They become actually their own site and are an intervention within that site, and are defined by very precise architectonic themes, like the house with path, the house with 3 walls, the house with 2 horizons, the house with curtains, and the house with flower walls, just to name a few of the 9. So this is an attempt to create, not only to create a new architectonic vocabulary, but also to make an attempt to redefine the program of habitation. That habitation, which has become more or less a commodity, should be redefined as a ritual. And in that respect, the house without rooms became maybe for me the most radical attempt to redefine and formalize that notion of the ritual of habitation, where the program, and again this is another argument, I mean I was talking before about the program of sight, that the notion that the elemental occurrence, the primary occurrence is the intervention in sight. The secondary occurrence is the confrontation with that site with a program, and I see this polarity of function and form, neither theorem that form follows function nor function follows form is correct, but it is a confrontation whereby of course the formal condition will always retain its power of abstraction, while the functional condition will always fluctuate. So in this case I took literally the program of, or the elemental reduction of the program of habitation to its tactile extreme, where I would deny a space which could be primarily experienced by the eyes, but rather by the body, and that the body of this imaginary inhabitant would have actually the power to become a synchronized device to affect the immediate condition of the architecture of the house itself. So wherever those 2 walls, Paul Lubovicius here will remember when we built the model of that house, this attempt of compression, that those 3 walls will just permit the body of the inhabitant to pass through, and only at those stations where the ritual of the basic habitation events takes place, the sleeping, the bathing, the shitting, the eating, and actually the moving through diagonally, there the walls will respond to the power of the body. So the body actually could penetrate those walls. At the same time, there is an attempt to differentiate between the various autonomous parts of the house. And each part, of course, has to have the power to retain its architectural autonomy in the process of decomposition. So here is the skeleton of the house, containing all the habitation spaces and the stairs, and then the outer armor, which then obscures the differentiated interior of the house and becomes an enigmatic skin. And then maybe as a synthesis of those conditions of a almost literal translation of program into an architectonic condition, and the idea of site and intervention in site as the primary occurrence in architecture, the project of the 7 Gates to Eden, where the 7 themes of imaginary houses would collide with a archetypical house, a house that has been solidified as an archetype. I only show one, that you can see the principle of that collision between now the imaginary house versus the archetypical, neutralized archetypical house. And maybe this idea of program, this confrontation, direct, ultimate confrontation between program and architecture, I've tried to accomplish in the house for Euclid, where then the program of the inhabitant is the work of the inhabitant himself. The innovations of geometry becomes then, again, as in the tactile sense of the house without rooms, becomes here a translation into architectonic condition through the power of geometry itself. And this whole idea of stability and instability, which of course is a fundamental issue in architecture since its beginnings. But what we maybe witness in the fashion of the so-called deconstructivism is a celebration of that instability simply because it's an intriguing former possibility. But I believe that if architecture starts to celebrate the complexity of life, it becomes simply a tool of that complexity. I believe that architecture has to be the contradictory pole toward that complexity of life. It has to become an expression of solitude. So in this house is really that this elemental confrontation between stability, which is rooted in our whole struggle of dealing with gravity, and the instability which comes through our questioning, through our critique, through theory, and through all our innovations within the ideal language of geometry. So the basic principle, and this house is very strangely based on a dream I had, and I usually never remember dreams, and I usually never have architecture dreams. This dream was very curious because Jim Sterling, or at least somebody who looks like Jim Sterling, took me to this mysterious site. There was a hill with a square plateau, and on those square plateaus were 4 little cubes which were in different tilted conditions. And so I literally took that idea, and those tilted cubes became the foundation for, let me just go back once more, the foundation for the cube. So when of course the frame of the cube is connected, those joints are stabilized and the cube is rigid. From a moment on, those quarters of the cube are destabilized, disconnected, then the cube can start to disintegrate, of course, within the rules of the original order of the cube, which is inherent in its geometrical origins. And then you would actually arrive at an infinite number of geometrical juxtaposition of those elements of the cube. And I'm showing now very deliberately projects which have not been made chronologically. This chair has been made at least 10 years before the House of Euclid, or even longer, 15 years. But what I'm interested in my work is somehow the uncontrollable occurrence of ideas which then reoccur under unpredictable circumstances. I mean, I once said to Danny Lipskin in a discussion, I said to Danny, I wish once you could digest the books you read and shit them out before they come straight out through your mouth. So, what I want to say is that when I accumulate knowledge compassionately, I don't think what that knowledge could produce in terms of my work. And I believe that one has to digest that knowledge and simply hope that it will reoccur. And so I'm showing now the correlation of those projects there, again, with the idea of a kinetic notion in architecture reduced to the smallest element, which I would consider architectural, the chair. Of course, at the same time, this project is also a manifestation of my belief that design cannot produce architecture. That means I took a designed object, a utilitarian object. I discovered its most powerful property, which is the axis, which is the common denominator between the user, the one who sits on the chair, and the object itself. And by simply cutting through that axis, violating its stability, and then reconciling that cut through a hinge, you can again, in a way, create an object that is still recognizable as a chair, but it will ultimately reach a point through that hinging when it is not anymore usable for the one who wants to sit on it. So there's also this kind of, for me, this phenomenal space where one cannot truly say anymore why this is not a chair anymore, why this is not a house anymore. So these are questions which I believe should not be answered as a theoretical conclusion, but rather as a possibility through experimentation. That all those, I consider my work continuous experiments. They reflect an absolute certainty on my part. They can be dismissed, opposed, even by myself afterwards, but when I make them, they are absolutely certain. I mean, I am certain that it means for me work is an elimination of speculation. I do not speculate when I work, I eliminate speculation. Do I have to focus or does this go? Okay. So I'm shifting now from what one could consider in conventional terms as imaginary architecture, architecture fantasies, whatever labels have been used before. Now moving into the domain where the site has a very definite memory. It's not anymore a site which has been, or which memory has been invented by myself, but it's a site that carries its own objective memory, and the intervention now has to be confronted with that particular memory. This project for the Times Square Tower in New York it was, for me, when I came to New York, you never had, in the 60s, you never had to read the newspaper when you wanted to go to the movies. You just went to Times Square and you chose a movie. And they were all, of course, cheaper because they were already, 2 weeks old. So for me, that memory of the Times Square as a place where cinema had conquered that segment of the city, and I literally took that memory and made a tower of cinemas, where cinemas are vertically organized, piled up, so to speak, in a very condensed. So, in a way, on one hand, a very literal translation of the program. On the other hand, of course, the former memory of Brancusi's infinite column. So again, there is this intuitive play between one's memory of particular former condition one adores, one has absorbed and learned. The attempt to resolve an architectural problem in its most elemental form, and then the ultimate resolution is then that very, for me, then retrospectively curious a conflict between pure architectonic form and pure programmatic interpretation. So I don't see a conflict in that. For me, use is a necessity. Without confronting an architectural, a formal condition with use, you cannot make architecture. So now from New York to Berlin, it is still the old Berlin, the Berlin where this very mysterious war had divided the city. Actually, I must admit I love this war. Not for political reasons, but for architectural reasons. It was the only city of our time which was surrounded by a war. The war, as you can see, was a very utilitarian war, had no architectural aspiration. It was not the Great Wall of China. It was an evil war because you could die when you climbed over it to the other side. But on the other side, it created a condition of desire. Like I remember when we were kids and we were climbing over walls into the neighbor's garden to steal cherries. There was this certain mystery of something behind a wall which one didn't see. There was the danger you encounter when you climbed over it into that unknown territory. And so while I was more or less implementing my project in Berlin, I spent a lot of time in Berlin, and I was somewhat very disturbed by the fact that this entire time, this 20 years this wall had been built, that there was no attempt, particularly within this International Building Exhibition, to make an attempt to make an architectural gesture toward the existence of this wall. So I made that attempt, and I made the proposal of a church on the Berlin Wall as the complete title of it, where I simply tried to show that I wanted to create an architectural condition whereby all the forces of the city would be concentrated in one place, in one building, and would come to a halt there. So even if the wall would disappear as it has now, it would signify the memory of that particular condition where the actual forces, social, political, and physical forces have come to a halt. I was before Christmas in Berlin, first time after the wall was down, and it was actually more severe. The idea of the wall was more severe because nothing had changed in terms of the appearance or the mood in East Berlin, but you could freely cross over with the cars. So cars went back and forth, but you had this invisible, powerful, imaginary wall which you had to penetrate, almost like a sound barrier. So this was the original intent to create. And again, in a very curious way, what has become obvious afterwards, that you have that church and cross, this crucifix formation of the church, I was not conscious of. Only after I photographed the model and saw that the shadow of the church actually was a cross projecting over the wall, I became aware of the crucifix condition. What I want to do, I mean, simply to create a body which consisted primarily of a tower of 4 walls. One of those walls would project it out into the back, become the entry to the church, to make space for the actual body of the church, the amorphous body that would push into the tower, which would contain the altar, and the horizontal beam would be simply a horizontal bell tower, carry the bells. Maybe one thing I should talk about is also the inversion of simple architectonic elements. While the cutout in the front wall facing the Berlin wall permitted direct light to fall into the darkness or indirectly illuminated interior of the church, the wall which was projected toward the back and became entry had a complete reverse meaning of the cutout. The cutout became a dark hole. So actually that passage through the same element which you experience in the inside reversed was also signifying the reversal of memory when you enter and when you leave the space of the church. Then this idea of enforcing this concentration of this axial has come to a halt in that tower in the form of the plan, so that actually the space of the congregation became a bridge separated from the amorphous wall of the body of the church, which then formed 2 imprints in the grounds. The whole layering now of, on one hand, this very fundamental intervention in the ground, so those the holes, the imprints of the body of the church, the bridge, the layering of the vertical planes, and then ultimately the projection of its own shadow over the other side, so the conquest of the other side to the shadow of the body of the church. Now this is the first project which would justify the date of 1982, which was announced by your brochure when I started to practice architecture. So, I mean, in a way, it was I think for me, almost like a traumatic experience, because in the 60s I decided not to build anymore. It was not imposed on me by the lack of commissions. I had built a few little houses in Austria for friends, probably all young architects do after the graduate school. But it was a very important decision for me to deny myself to become a sort of like, without transition, a practicing or professional architect. So the return now to that world of professionalism, and ultimately you have to be confronted with, because you have to deal with the professionals who ultimately build it, was a traumatic experience. And so I just show you now the stages from the first project for the competition, which I won by the International Building Exhibition. And what I tried to sort of like to remember was the infrastructure of the old Berlin. Berlin is a city of very decisive city blocks which confine and protect generous collective courtyards, and very decisive axes then which would cut through the body of those city blocks. So I try now to propose a new definition of that edge of the city block, of course reminiscent of the memory of the war, where almost 80% of Berlin had been destroyed in bombardments. So I proposed a war which was a war of fragments, a wall that was partially bridge, partially frame, a wall that would connect to old fragments with the new fragments, would also provide interventions within that frame of different kinds of architecture propositions. The only element that I developed decisively was then the corner of that city block, and this corner was the most stable element. It in a way reflected all the forces of the intersection of the streets, the forces from the courtyard, and the memory, of course, of the ruinous past of the city itself. The original site for that corner was a very controversial site. It belonged actually to the police department, and so it had never been realized. And so I was given a site across the street from the corner, which sort of resulted in what I would call a gatehouse. So this was a proposal of now the translation of the original corner into a specific site as a connecting element of an existing large existing building of a publishing house, which was partially destroyed during the war. And across you see the section now through the Gatehouse, and this was the site defined on the left by a rather large building from the 30s, to the right the eclectic building from the turn of the century. So for me, the site, before I even got involved in the specific definition of the program that it was a apartment building with shops on the street level, for me the site was a fragment of the city itself. So I tried to project those elements which I had developed in the first scheme through that very small fragment. And so for me it was a significant demand to protect the memory of the void, the memory of the destruction of the missing buildings. And this determined really the architectural theme. So I tried to make the intervention into a structure that would be at the same time a bridge connecting those two very different fragments from the past, and at the same time never really succeed in bridging, and actually would become just the opposite, namely a cut. And this cut then would form a transitional space between the public space of the street leading toward the more intimate space of the courtyard. Now, this paradox of bridging and cutting led then to that diagonal structure of those hanging terraces. That means I tried also to redefine the idea of facade. And a facade is ultimately a condition where all the forces which are perpendicular to the public space are condensed in one plane. So I tried now to make a architectonic landscape out of that plane, and also reverse those forces which are perpendicular to the street and turn them toward the cut. And this resulted in that particular structure and that differentiation of that facade into a actually accessible landscape. The curious story of that building, of the construction of the building, was that the contractor was located in West Germany, and for him the most efficient way of building that would be to prefabricate the whole building in West Germany, load the parts on trucks and bring it to Berlin and construct it there. So this was really, I think, the most exciting part of the construction process. Now, in plan you see that this whole dialectical topology of the building itself. First, that facade landscape, the cut, then the cut is reconciled to the bridge of the interior staircase, and then ultimately the gate leading to the private courtyard in the back. So now I'm simply guide you through that, and here in the section you see exactly that topographical articulation, the landscape to the street, the cut, the bridge of the stairwell, and then the embracing elements of the courtyard. This just proof that I could also do working drawing. So this is now the start of the journey from the entry through the first division of the cut. In the cut there was also a sort of a hanging device to have a visual separation between the facing terraces. A sort of a glass curtain was carried by that truss. Then the bridge of the stairwell, which was separated from the wall, so it actually the light would filter through the sides. So when you ascend or descend, you would actually experience the increase or decrease of the intensity of the light from the bottom up to the top. And then the passing under the stairwell bridge, and the first indication now of the change of geometry from the orthogonal to the circular, just to those two signs of the not touching beams. And then the completion toward the courtyard itself. Now in between I just showed it sort of as a project of curiosity, because you probably all know the first prize, and it was the second prize of the Jewish Museum in Berlin, which was won by Danny Libeskind. And for me that was in a way a very interesting German phenomenon, this competition, because it was declared as the Jewish Museum. In actuality, it was the expansion of the Berlin Museum, which is the History Museum of Berlin, and the Jewish Museum was a fraction in terms of the program of the. But on the other hand, it became for me a decisive theme to show that actually what happened in the years from 1933 to 1945 can never be reconciled, never politically nor architecturally. So we devised a formal condition that showed that irreconcilable conflict between the stable extension of the Berlin Museum, the stable extension also of the history of Berlin, and then this collides then with that very violent form which then houses the Jewish Museum. Geometrically, it's a very almost like literal response to the geometry of the site itself. There's the old axis, which actually was the main axis leading to the Marienplatz. This is from the old city center, which then had been destroyed in the 50s, and then the response to the curve. So one way a very almost like trivial immediate response to the geometry of the site, and then a very ideal condition of the composition of the various elements. And then the Jewish Museum, of course, was not a museum where you could exhibit things. It was a very severe, simply separation of rooms, of cells for contemplation, where actually then ultimately time would cease at the point where the curve and the other axis would dissect. Now, this is a project which is now in construction in Vienna. I mean, don't worry, it's going to be probably the last project for a long time. But somehow, in a way, it's like contagious. When you start to build one, then suddenly you get the commission for another. And in a way, I become, when I say don't worry, I was actually talking to myself, because I start to get worried, because I feel that it is a complete different process of thinking about architecture when you build than when you draw. Because the building process has become so stupefied meanwhile. I mean, when you remember in the Renaissance, I mean, Palladio made a little woodcut with some basic proportional principle, and the builder knew exactly how to build it. And now you have to make plans after plans after plans simply to protect your own liability against the enemies, or whoever the enemies are, including your client. So this is a very curious origins. As you well know, in Vienna, the city government has been socialist since the downfall of the monarchy after the First World War, and particularly developed in the 30s. Revolutionary new principles of social housing. And meanwhile, this program of social housing, as the whole political system in Austria has deteriorated to a almost Disneyland kind of level, and so the Conservative Party had decided also to enter, for political reasons, of course, to enter the program of social housing. And curiously, they have succeeded to get younger architects, experimental architects involved in those projects. They make little competitions, and this is privately financed. This is one of those projects. I have been invited to a small competition which I won. So it's a project where I had devised the urban plan, and within that typology, 3 other architects then have been designated to build the various parts. And this is in a way for me a very important project, because there are many principles which I have compassionately followed in my independent work. I was able to introduce into that project. So I read this project as a city fragment where I tried to record typology from old cities. So the site is defined by those indigenous irregular geometrical boundaries, which I simply reinforced by a city wall, and then imposed a ideal field with 100-meter wide, which then would collide with that indigenous configuration of the outer edge and form what I call a perspective, elongated perspective square. And then this ideal field is then violently dissected by the Cartesian cross of the cardinal points. So you have the whole plan is then rooted in the cross of the cardinal points. You have the east-west axis and the south-north axis, and then within, of course, you have the whole definition of typological elements along that field. So this is now the contextual relationship of the plan. It's surrounded by it's sort of really at the edge of the city, surrounded by industrial developments and partially open fields. So it's really it's almost like it signifies the edge. I mean, the whole expansion of the city comes to a halt at that point. And so here is the typological definition of the various elements. Above you have the definition of the various open spaces, the elongated perspective square. Actually, when you are in the vanishing point on the other side, all horizontal lines are parallel. Then the elevated central square, the cross, and the streets, and then the volumetric types, the city wall, which is, you will see, articulated by 3 different elements, 2 wall elements and 1 corner element, Then the row houses within the field, the central square with the atrium houses, and 4 small cubes which house the communal functions. House for children, a bathhouse, a house for old people, and a house for teenagers. So these are now within now this plan. These are the elements which I am building right now. The corner building, which links the 2 elements of the city wall, the 3 row houses which are dissected by the east-west axis, and one of the 4 communal cubes. So I'm just going sort of quickly through that series. So, for example, again, there's this, you're confronted with a conventional terminology of row house. And row house has certain, for me, a very almost fatalistic quality, because, I mean, there's one inhabitant is forced to live next to the other. Instead of, in a way, hiding that condition, I try to reinforce it, make those singular houses into rhythmic elements, so the whole row house became almost like a musical instrument with a very distinct, different mood toward the entry, where you have those towers of the stairs, small cuts which permit circulation through it, and then the major gate, which is the gate where the east-west axis of the Cartesian cross is cutting through. So you have, in a way, a rhythmic condition of 3-3-3-3, then 3-3-4-2, and 3-3-5-1. And this is the reversed side toward the gardens, where you have again rhythmic elements which are double-story living rooms. And this is now the present state of construction. You have a very hermetic wall toward the entry, only with hidden openings to the bathroom. So you have the bathrooms and the stair tower and the entry on one side. So here now you have that gate, and of course to that gate you create in a way a communal space that also would give the inhabitant a different sense of experience through different kind of orientation, different meaning of that orientation. So you have the gates leading toward the center of the cross, and then the gate toward the back becomes a window, a frame, framing the fragments of the past of the existing landscape. And this is the corner, and the entry into the corner, of course, again has a double meaning. It is on one hand a connecting element of the 2 wall fragments, on the other hand becomes the entry to that whole city fragment. I mean, I always call it city, but there's a very wonderful word in German which is called Siedlung, which has a very precise history and tradition in modern architecture. The Siedlung was the new city fragment for the workers, built next to the factories, and became, I think you all know, the project of Taut and May in Germany, became significant contributions to the heroic period of modern architecture. So in a way, I see this as a continuation of that tradition. And this is the last, and this is one of the 4 cubes. where I simply had defined for the other three architects, the definition of its volume, the definition of its exterior, and then according to the different programs, each one could then develop the interior accordingly. And so this is, as I said, is the children's house, where I also want to state that in this case I don't provide furniture, play furniture, or I project any predetermined way of children to play, but the architecture itself should become the toy for the children to play with. And this is the last of my build projects of the house, which is sort of a project for friends. They had a house near Innsbruck in the Alps, and why I show it, because there's this reoccurring element of a simple utilitarian fragment of the house, which is the stair tower, which then becomes for me a very important formal element for my architecture. So this was a house from the turn of the century where they simply wanted to utilize each floor independently, and so I proposed to move the stair to the outside, and so the stair became for me like a guardian, a witness to that house. So I'm just going sort of quickly through that series. So, for example, again, there's this, you're confronted with a conventional terminology of row house. And row house has a certain, for me, a very almost fatalistic quality, because, I mean, there's one inhabitant is forced to live next to the other. Instead of, in a way, hiding that condition, I try to reinforce it, make those singular houses into rhythmic elements, so the whole row house became almost like a musical instrument with a very distinct, different mood toward the entry, where you have those towers of the stairs, small cuts, which permit circulation through it, and then the major gate, which is the gate where the east-west axis of the Cartesian cross is cutting through. So you have, in a way, a rhythmic condition of 3-3-3-3, then 3-3-4-2, and 3-3-5-1. And this is the reversed side toward the gardens, where you have again rhythmic elements, which are double-story living rooms. And this is now the present state of construction. You have a very hermetic wall toward the entry, only with hidden openings to the bathroom. So you have the bathrooms and the stair tower and the the entry on one side. So here now you have that gate, and of course to that gate you create in a way a communal space that also would give the inhabitants a different sense of experience through different kind of orientation, different meaning of that orientation. So you have the gates leading toward the center of the cross, and then the gate toward the back becomes a window, a frame, framing the fragments of the past of the existing landscape. And this is the corner, and the entry into the corner, of course, again has a double meaning. It is on one hand a connecting element of the two wall fragments, on the other hand becomes the entry to that whole city fragment. I mean, I always call it city, but there's a very wonderful word in German which is called Siedlung, which has a very precise history and tradition in modern architecture. The Siedlung was the new city fragment for the workers, built next to the factories, and became, I think you all know the project of Taut and May in Germany, became significant contributions to the heroic period of modern architecture. So in a way, I see this as a continuation of that tradition. And this is the last. This is one of the 4 cubes, where I simply had defined for the other 4 architects, for the 3 architects, the definition of its volume, the definition of its exterior, and then according to the different programs, each one could then develop the interior accordingly. And so this is, as I said, is the children's house, where I also want to state that in this case I don't provide furniture, play furniture, or I project any predetermined way of children to play, but the architecture itself should become the toy for the children to play with. And this is the last of my build projects of the house, which is sort of a project for friends. They had a house near Innsbruck in the Alps, and why I show it, because there's this reoccurring element of a simple utilitarian fragment of the house, which is the stair tower, which then becomes for me a very important formal element for my architecture. So this was a house from the turn of the century, where they simply wanted to utilize each floor independently, and so I proposed to move the stair to the outside, and so the stair became for me like a guardian, a witness to that house. And also, I believe that poetry is hidden in the ordinary. I don't think that poetry is a golden cloud one can go and catch. If you're lucky, you catch. If you don't, you don't. I think poetry is hidden in the ordinary. One has to dig for it. One has to not to shy away from a little dirt. And so that was, in a way, that what I see the virtue of that project is taking a very simple, ordinary program of a staircase and trying to make architecture with it. So, could we switch I only have one more project which I want to show you, which is my competition project for the Acropolis Museum. You know, in my, actually when I started still in school, I used to, when I was growing up in the Tyrol, of course, the only way you could survive in the mountains that you become a mountain climber, I started to raise skis and all that. So for me, when I discovered there were competitions in architecture, it was for me somehow the continuation of sports, of competition where you in a way measure your own corruptibility because you speculate with juries and winning and all that. And so I did, since the beginning, I always did competitions. And how would I say, I almost see those competition projects I have done most of the time successfully, somehow outside of my work, in a very strange way. I mean, they carry a lot of my ideas, of course, otherwise I wouldn't do it, but with the exception of this project, I told that Michael before, this was one I really wanted. And this was a two-stage competition, and there were already, I think, 3 competitions before which all failed, which were only limited to Greek architects. So this was the first international one, and so I won 3rd prize. The first prize is a project that is, I would say, syndromatic for our time. I mean, we all, or at least I, witnessed the destruction of 2 great museums in New York in the last 20 years. One is the Metropolitan, but much more valuable to me was the Museum of Modern Art, which was for me one of the most intimate, most powerful, particularly in this country, maybe the greatest contribution of the wealthy in America to the arts. And it has been destroyed simply because museums as art has become a commodity, has become business, and the justification for expansion is, of course, is the idea that it has to be made accessible to more people. See, I believe the program of museum originated as a room to study, where one could retreat and contemplate and focus on manifestations of art. Etymologically, it's rooted, of course, in the Greek mythology of the Muses. And so what, of course, happened is that in this particular program, you're faced not only with a almost, with a frightening attempt to house the most, I think, important sculptures made in all times, but to be also confronted with one of the most overwhelming sites of antiquity. For me, this was really an exercise of humility. That's where one realizes in the process of thinking about the idea of museum, thinking about the proximity of the intervention to the Acropolis site, sort of like cut out all attempts of force originality in the process. And besides that, of course, is the other paradox is that through the pollution, the culture is forced to remove the original sculptures which are integral part of the architecture and put them into a alienated artificial environment. So for me, this museum has become a tomb for the Greek sculptures, where the sculptures are the primary inhabitants of the museums, not the visitors. And the project the jury had chosen is exactly designed for the visitors, is sort of a Disneyland for where you could look at the originals of the Acropolis. So the principal intention of this intervention was to impose a square upon the fragmentary and geometrically rather varying site, and this square is only violated by two elements. One is an existing building built at the turn of the century, which houses the Center for Acropolis Studies, which had to be retained and which should become an integral part of the new museum, and then a central prismatic piece, which you will see more precisely in the model, which would be the only symbolic gesture toward the site of antiquity where those sculptures are coming from. So this element becomes signal and window at the same time. And what this lower composition of sides shows are the way I read the significance of the proximity of the site to the Acropolis, like in the tradition of the historic evolution of gestures toward the Acropolis. When the Romans came, they built their temple of Apollo very much modestly on the lower flat parts of the city. And so I read the significance of that project as a continuation of an attempt of making a gesture toward the significance and monumentality of Greek architecture and of the site of the Acropolis. So again here you have this juxtaposition of the three sites, the Acropolis, the fragments of the Temple of Apollon, the Roman Temple of Apollon, and the section now through the museum, where you see now the violation now of the horizontal, very simple horizontal condition of the square and the diagonal of the prismatic window. And again, also, I believe that this museum, despite its, of course, monumental nature, based on its programmatic significance, should also become a normal part of the city itself. So there should be different kind of entry conditions from various parts of the city. You could enter it from various parts, not only from the archaeological site. So in a way, toward the archaeological site, you have a whole landscape of different historic fragments, a little church from the 18th century, a small building from the 16th century, little excavations, and then the building of the Center for Acropolis Studies, and ordinary apartment buildings at the edge. And so as you see, there is this also in plan, is that very distinct juxtaposition of the entry as the core, which is the only one that violates the very tranquil, quiet rooms where the various parts, and in a way I took the almost spatial sequence of the Acropolis, the Erechtheion, the Temple of Athena Nike, and the Parthenon as the main galleries on one level, and I in a way try to create spaces that recall, except as an inversion, the position of the sculptures as they were placed on the original temples. So what has been seen, let's say in the Parthenon gallery, what has been seen on the temple from the outside is now inverted into see it from the inside. The central core because you can also see there's a very clear distinction between the public spaces. To the outside you have like an underground, since the site is sloping, like an underground assembly space where this slab, this building, the existing building penetrates. So actually you are confronted with the foundation of the building as a spatial element within that assembly space, and then the theater, and then you enter the actual core of the museum. And so, in terms of its architectonic definitions, there was also again a juxtaposition of two technologies. One, the old technology, archaic technology of a wall built out of stones, which is the outer definition of the museum, and then the steel structure to provide larger spans and the thinner skin on the inside. And here you see more or less the spirit of the interior spaces. I try to create really very definite rooms which one could enter, one could concentrate on. One is encompassed by the spirit of the sculptures belonging to one temple, which is then confined to each of those rooms. And only the central core, that was that element that would connect visually and physically to the outside world, and would also be governed by the visual axis defined by its geographical position toward the Acropolis. And ultimately, it's again a return to a project which I made almost 20 years before, the house with two horizons, where the same idea is already manifest and has come back in a different way. So I would just read few thoughts to return to a more, I think, esoteric dimension from the visual one to conclude this evening. When everything has become possible through technology, it might be that nothing is possible anymore. The methodology of sequential thought will encounter the resistance of thought itself, and the development exhausts itself in the impossible. But hope hidden in the impossible may provide a new vision. To embark for unpredictable journeys, not wanting to be a teacher, to acquire the courage to question and ultimately to deny the predictability of development, to generate impulses of resistance, to mediate, intervene, intercede, to create images which, by going beyond the signification of resistance, become resistance, images denying obedience to the boundaries of historic memory to become memory, not to remember, but to be remembered. Borders are essential to pass judgment, borders as metaphors. To be dissolved when the judgment is passed, moments of critical positions. Borders are to probe, to surmise, yet undecipherable, to embody borders by their absence. Borders conceived as passages, compressed, shattered within their own density, to become fragments of new borders. Object and image appear inseparably interlocked by invisible and inseparable borders. Yet the awareness of their inseparability, incapable to liberate them from their own denseness, becomes the essential impulse toward reality, of a continuously changing reality, because space and time are inseparable yet exchangeable. In what direction is architecture going? Architecture moves toward itself, to dissolve in itself, to become speechless for the sake of silence, yet filled with the desire to signify its solitude. Silent, unknown signs, in the written image immutable, in the drawn image unspeakable, in the built image uninhabitable. The mystery of these images become the myth of the journey of architecture and the odyssey of the imaginary inhabitants who attempt to decipher them. By emerging as the protagonist and hero of survival, Ulysses destroyed the myth of his own journey. He never succumbed to the treachery of all the imaginary spaces which threatened his survival. Their magic remained immutable. The memory of events and spaces within the boundaries of the continuum of mutative time connects the stations of the journey. Only when the helpless wanderer is conquered by memory, his role becomes definable, and the odyssey becomes journey again. Dangers without risk, not anymore ode but episode. In the solitude of silence, whisper screams. One ought to try to reduce everything spatially to dot zero. The search for dot zero is a surveyor's odyssey. All spatial properties lie hidden in this point. Yet it is this point, inaccessible, defiant of any methodology, that would make it worthwhile to search for and to cherish its revelations. How much pride do architects show for their buildings, and how clumsy are their manifestations? But the temple had first to yield to destruction before one could contemplate its genesis. The curricula of most architecture schools remind me of schedules for public transport. Journeys without risk, all destinations predetermined, impeccably programmed, and well connected. I think one ought to tear up the roads and twist the tracks that we can once again explore imaginary landscapes, to wander astray on tracks without markings. A quote of Joubert, "All my stars on one singular heaven, the entire space is my tent, the fallen stars of my spirit." Wittgenstein's proposition that architecture perpetuates and glorifies, yet if there is nothing that deserves glorification, there is no need for architecture, can be refuted by the fact that architecture has already crossed that threshold of glorification by its own negation. Architecture takes care of itself, and in the depth of speechlessness becomes a manifestation of silence. Thank you very much. So, how do you want to take some questions? No, I mean, I always yield to tradition if there is a sense of questions or... Okay, ask. What the mood is.
If there's any questions, you can ask them now. You want to turn up the house lights?
Should we wait for a hardcore to stay or just forget about it? Huh? Let's forget about it. Yeah. Let's go in there. Okay, thank you.